7 to 8 years as she educates that offspring in what types of things to eat, what stuff you don't do, how you find food, things to stay away from, etc., etc. So for the male, 15 minutes of copulation is a low energy exercise plus a commitment of some very inexpensive gametes, whereas for the female, the contribution is this very expensive egg plus diverting resources to the building of the fetus, diverting resources to increasing the size of the infant, and diverting resources that you could use for yourself as you educate your offspring. Okay, so Darwin recognized for a lot of species, I just did an orangutan, but for him he was talking a lot about birds, that there's a very different commitment in terms of the two sexes. Now, if this is the way things are, then I would expect selection to work on males and females independently. Because they're being exposed to different selection regimes, I expect the traits that they develop to be very different from one another. And they are. So here, if males gain a corresponding increase in fitness for an increase in copulation, then I would expect natural selection to select for traits that increase the likelihood of additional copulations in males. Okay? And it's working on all these males simultaneously. So the males should all be trying to increase their fitness by increasing their copulations, and as a consequence, they're competing with each other for access to these females so that they can derive some sort of fitness. And one of the things Darwin says is that a consequence of this type of selection on males is that males are selected to be more competitive. Because if they're competitive with each other for access to the females, the ones that are better at competing are the ones that derive additional fitness, which would select for individuals that are more competitive, etc., etc. On the other hand, Darwin says for females, because they don't derive additional fitness from additional copulations, instead, they're limited a lot by resources. Males are limited by access to females. Females are limited by resources. It's expensive to raise these offspring. It's expensive to allocate resources to reproduction. So Darwin argues that females overall should be selected to be more choosy. So what I want to do now is kind of break these a little bit apart and just talk a little bit about kind of Darwinian sexual selection theory and how this kind of is played out, in particular in the animal kingdom. Okay? All right, so males are predicted to be competitive with each other. But there's a danger of engaging in competition if you're a male. If the males are being selected to become more and more competitive with each other, then we might reach a situation where males are literally battling each other for access to females. Anytime males fight with each other or compete aggressively with each other, there's always the chance of injury. So it looks like what selection has done over evolutionary time is selected for competitive behavior, but this competition is heavily ritualized. And by ritualized, I mean there's a series of very specific steps that are part of the ritual. Okay, much like going to church. Church has its own rituals, right? You do certain things before others. Those of you that are Catholic, right, there are certain steps in the Mass that happen before others. That's part of the ritual. Well, the ritual for male combat is a series of steps that are meant to minimize the likelihood of physical aggression and therefore minimize the likelihood that somebody is going to get injured. Okay? All right, so I've grabbed a few male species around the animal kingdom to show you kind of what this ritualized combat looks like. So this is Drosophila sylvestris. There are two males there. They're standing on their tiptoes, and as part of the male combat ritual, they're just trying to see who's taller. Okay, the individual that's taller can see over the top of the other one. The one who's shorter can't see over the top, and this is how they resolve the competition. They stand up, the taller one wins, and the shorter one goes home. Okay? All right. This one, Drosophila heteroneura, here they have very wide heads, and they're trying to see who has the widest head. The male that has the wider head can see past the other one, whereas the thinner head can't see past. This is how the combat is resolved. The males check a particular trait against each other, and based on that trait, they decide winners and losers. Okay, that's the ritual. Okay, here, these are stag beetles. They get up on top of a stick or a log, typically not very far off the ground. It's not like if you get knocked off, you die because you fall 50,000 stories. They're just going to see who can knock the other one off of the stick. The one who wins is the one who wins the combat, gains access to the female. The one who doesn't win, the loser, goes home. Here, male giraffes are using their heads and necks as clubs. It's a little more extreme, a little more violent behavior, but my expectation is that their necks and heads should be designed for this kind of thing. Otherwise, it would mean bad news for both of them. Right. Here are two elephants engaged in male-to-male combat. In this case, they line up with each other and they do a little bit of pushing, and the one that can push the one backwards is the winner. The one that gets pushed backwards is the loser. Okay, elephant seals. This is basically a little bit of sumo wrestling. The one who's taller typically wins. If they're around the same height, they'll try to push each other over. Okay. All right. The idea is that this combat has been ritualized over evolutionary time to avoid the likelihood of this spilling out into physical violence. And some years I spent a little bit of time on kind of human male kind of ritualized combat. It's a little difficult here over the video camera. But if you think about kind of how combat in males is ritualized, you think of like an NBA basketball game. Two males have had it with each other. They don't immediately start throwing punches. They go through this kind of ritualized behavior first, right? They yell at each other. The other one yells back. Then the other one swears, and the other one swears back. And then they puff up their chest to try to look bigger. And then the other one puffs up his chest. And then they may come together in butt chests and get really close together in each other's space. And then maybe one of them pushes the other, and then one pushes back. And then at that point, maybe they start throwing fists at each other. But the idea is that that combat's heavily ritualized before we get to the fist, where we're trying to avoid it, and at any point in time, either of the two males could back off of this competition. And the idea is the other male, as the winner, lets him go. He doesn't then take a big bat and hit him over the head with it. All right. Okay. On the female side of things, the question then is, if females are acting choosy, what the heck are they choosy for? Well, one of the things might be kind of the general attractiveness of the male. Whatever particular traits that female tends to find attractive, she might be attracted to those traits. And if we have a population of females that find the same trait attractive, then we set up an interesting situation where the female is going to gain fitness by selecting that most attractive male, because her sons will tend to have that attractive trait, which increases the fitness of her sons. Does that make sense? There's some interesting theory in all this called runaway sexual selection to explain things like widow birds. They're African birds that have very long tails, and they're called widow birds because the males have this long plumage here that makes it tough for them to fly and get away from predators, but this is a very attractive trait to all of the females. So even though this male here loses in terms of survivorship, the increased reproduction by having this trait offsets the decrease in survivorship. Peacocks, the same thing, right? That elaborate plumage of the male peacock really lowers its survivorship because it's hard for it to fly and get away from predators. But females find that trait attractive, and that means that her sons will have that same attractive trait as well. Okay? Females might be choosy for health. Health is an indicator of greater survivorship. The health indicates something about the fitness of the male overall. Again, if we were in class, I might ask questions about whether females find a male who hasn't bathed in a long time, or who has body odor, or whose mouth, a lot of mouth odor, if those things are attractive, and typically they're not. Females tend to prefer males that are much healthier because that is an indicator of how well they survive. In birds, this health is easy to see as color, right? Cardinals are bright red in color. That's reflective of their overall health and how able they are to gather resources from the environment. That should mean that his offspring should have similar traits. The female is increasing the survivorship of her offspring by mating with males that are of high health, right? Plumage, that's all those feathers and things. They can get parasites in them. Female birds are not attracted to males that have parasites. Again, this is an indicator of overall health. Okay? I'm trying to think through here a couple more. Resources. In many species, the male's ability to gather resources is what's being checked by the female. If males can gather resources, that can help the female meet her resource demands for reproduction. In many species, this plays out as a nuptial gift. That's a gift presented by the male to the female, and as part of the nuptial gift, mating can occur. So in many species of spiders, the males present the females with a nuptial gift. The females eat the nuptial gift while mating occurs. The more resources the male spends on the nuptial gift, the more copulation occurs. The less he spends, the shorter the copulation time. Dance flies do the same thing. The male presents the female with a nuptial gift. While she's eating the nuptial gift, mating occurs. In some species, the resources offered as a nuptial gift are to the extreme. A couple species of cricket, they actually offer their wings. The female eats the wings of the male while he's mating. Or if you think about the praying mantis, the male is offering himself as a nuptial gift. He derives fitness through the copulation. The female gets the resources that the male had accumulated his entire life. Okay? So again, Darwin's suggestion here that males are selected to be more competitive and have a ritualized combat. On the other hand, females, depending on the species, might be attracted to different things, but overall these things relate directly to her fitness, either directly through resources or indirectly by increasing the fitness of her offspring. Okay? All right. That's sexual selection. Okay, now what we need to do is finish off this unit on evolutionary theory. We're done with sexual selection, which means we're done with all of these evolutionary forces. I said before that what makes all of these evolutionary forces are their ability to change allele frequencies in the bucket. If the force can change allele frequencies in populations, by definition it's an evolutionary force. What I want to do now is talk about one more kind of evolutionary topic, but it's not an evolutionary force because it can't change allele frequencies, but it's a good one to talk about now because it relates to one of these forces. So what I want to talk about here is called inbreeding. Okay? And I'm going to put right here, not an evolutionary force, because it can't change allele frequencies. All right, so what's inbreeding? Well, inbreeding is the mating of closely related individuals okay? And notice in this definition there's nothing in here about good, bad, or ugly, right? It's just the mating of closely related individuals. And for some species, inbreeding is not a problem because there are no negative effects to inbreeding. However, for many species, there are negative effects of inbreeding, and these negative effects collectively are called inbreeding depression. So another way to state this would be to say that some species, inbreeding depression is the effect of inbreeding, and for some species there is no inbreeding depression. Right? Negative effects of inbreeding. So I've got something here I pulled off a website called the Australian Shepherd Health and Genetics Institute. It's a dog website for Australian Shepherds. And here they're talking about inbreeding and inbreeding depression. Inbreeding depression is the loss of viability or